My name is James Crabtree. I'm a comment editor of the Financial Times, and I'll be sharing this. It's now 6:30. We'll go until about 7:45, maybe 8 o'clock, if the discussion after the talk is if you're all highly engaged. And David, you want to speak for? How long do you want to speak for?
90 minutes.
No more than 2 hours. David sort of doesn't really need any introduction anyway. I'll flatter him briefly to say that he is the leading intellectual on the moderate conservative right, in so much as there is a Cameroonian thinker in America that is David. He's had a sort of fascinating, distinguished career, both as an author, a presidential speechwriter, a prominent American think tanker, and now, I suppose, a new media activist, moving with the times on his website Frum, which is one of the must-reads for anyone trying to keep abreast of the currents of the American right. And I presume this evening I'm going to talk about the state of American conservatism and where it is likely to go next and where it should go next, which I suspect will not quite be the same thing. And with that, I'll hand over to David.
James, thank you for that very generous introduction. I thank all of you for coming. And I especially thank my friends at Policy Exchange for hosting this talk. The American think tank industry now rivals American universities. The big four center-right think tanks, right-of-center think tanks, I should say, Heritage, AEI, Cato, and the Manhattan Institute, together spend $125 million a year. It is a real testament that Policy Exchange is able to do really quite as much as all of them put together on a budget, I think, somewhat less than $125 million a year. Although, who knows, given the price of orange juice in the United Kingdom, who knows what it is. I am not going to speak long because I want to reserve time for discussion. I want to give you a very direct presentation of the way things look in the United States right now. It is a very dramatic and exciting moment. It's a moment where there's some real hope of reversing some of the extraordinary overreach that occurred during the Obama years, and of arresting the progress that if you can call it progress, that the United States was making under President Obama toward a much more centralized, much more regulated, much more heavily taxed economy. At exactly the same time that there's real hope in the United Kingdom of the reverse, America is going very much in the wrong direction. And the best news from the likely result in November is that will probably be slowed or stopped altogether. That is the best news. But there's other news that is not so good, and I would like to discuss today what that is. The likeliest case scenario in November is, of course, that the Republicans will take the House of Representatives. I think that is pretty generally expected by most people, although it's not impossible that they will fall just short. Nor is it impossible, by the way, that they will score really huge and historic 1894 style gains. There's a lot of chance in the upcoming congressional elections. I think back in 2006, there was something like 24 seats that were decided by very narrow margin of about 10,000 votes or so, if I remember that right. And almost all of them went to the Republicans. The Republicans just got lucky in 2006. As bad as 2006 was, it could easily have been worse. And again, those seats have been lost in 2008. So there is a margin of what happens with the traffic, what happens with the weather in a lot of races that can determine whether it's 38 or 42 or 46. I think the likely case scenario is that Republicans do not take the United States Senate. It is, again, not impossible that they can, but a lot of things would have to break very right for them to do so. More likely, again, they will pick up somewhere between 4 and 6 seats. But that changes the balance of power dramatically as well. When these results occur, you will hear a great shout of triumph from the most hard-edged elements of the American right. And there will be a triumph both over President Obama, but with a lot of asterisks and many way down the list of footnotes over people like me and like others. Jim Manzi is here, like him, like Ross Duthat, like Ryan Salam, these are names you may know, of people who said the Republicans needed a different course. Rush Limbaugh was on the airwaves, I understand, just yesterday, denouncing me by name, calling me both wrong and also crazy, for good measure, for suggesting there was anything that needed to be changed. Republicans have won, conservatism has won, this is a great triumph, it's a great vindication of the Tea Party approach, of the take no prisoners approach. This is what they will say, and let me tell you why it is completely mistaken. The object of politics is not to win elections. Winning elections is a means to an end. The object is to govern, to advance your values, to advance your principles. By that score, the past 2 years have been about as badly managed as any political party has ever managed. The outcome for Republicans, for conservatism, for individual enterprise is much worse than it needed to be. And again and again, it was this die-hard element in the Republican Party that made things worse. Let me give you just a couple of examples of, that I think are of overwhelming importance. The first is, I don't know if you've been following the race in the state of Pennsylvania. This is a seat that was formerly, that is currently held by Senator Arlen Specter, the Republican turned Democrat. It is now in a very close battle between Joe Sestak and Pat Toomey. Sestak being the Democrat, Toomey being the Republican. It looks like Toomey may well win. And those of us who have complained about Toomey's performance over the past 2 years will be told that we were wrong to see Toomey on the seat. One of the things I wrote about Toomey was that if healthcare passed, the Democratic National Committee should build a statue to Pat Toomey, because he was the man most single-handedly responsible for its passage. Here was the state of play. Coming out of the 2008 elections, the Democrats had a disciplined majority in the House of Representatives, but they had 59 seats in the Senate. That is an important number because, of course, you need 60 to cut off debate and to govern the Senate in the same disciplined way that you govern the House. The Democrats were just that one short of 60. That gave Republicans the power of 41, as Bob Dole called it back during the Clinton days, because the Republicans had 41 seats after the election of 1992. With 41, you can force the majority to negotiate with them. With 40, you are run roughshod over just as you are run roughshod over in the House of Representatives if you have even one less than half. That power of 41 was dissipated. Senator Specter voted with the Democrats on the notorious $800 billion stimulus bill. It was a bad vote. He did the wrong thing. At that point, Pat Toomey announced that he would do a primary challenge to Specter. He had done it previously in 2004, and he began to raise a lot of money. It was going to be a very credible challenge, and Pennsylvania Republicans were understandably so angry at Arlen Specter that Toomey's numbers began to rise and rise and rise. But the result of that, and the predictable result of that, was that Specter, at that moment, didn't wait to lose. At that moment, he re-affiliated as a Democrat, and he gave the Democrats their 60th seat. The filibuster-proof majority, which allowed them then to shove through healthcare reform. Now, Specter, as a Republican, would not have voted for healthcare reform in the form that he took, the way that he did vote for the stimulus, for this reason. Pennsylvania is, I think, second or third after Iowa and Florida, having the largest number of senior citizens of any state. The senior citizens were the group that most disliked the Obamacare plan because it took money out of Medicare, the healthcare program for the seniors, to transfer to other kinds of subsidies. So, on the other hand, he did vote for the stimulus because Pennsylvania is also a heavily unionized state, and the unions like the stimulus. So, on the weather vane, the same weather vane principle that led Specter to vote for the stimulus would have led him to vote against health care, at least in the form it was proposed. But the Toomey challenge knocked Specter into the Democratic camp, gave them that 60-seat majority that they held until Ted Kennedy died, and then Scott Brown won the open Kennedy seat, and enabled the passage of this thing. If Specter had been tolerated, the whole course of history would have been different. Then, as the bill began to proceeded through the House and the Senate, again and again and again, there was a refusal to negotiate, a refusal to try to cut some kind of deal, because it was said that if we could defeat this thing, we would hand Obama a defeat of the magnitude of that which was dealt to Bill Clinton, and that would thwart his presidency, which was seen as very important to do because Obama is a genuinely more left-wing figure than Bill Clinton, genuinely more hostile to markets and enterprise, and the majority behind him also more hostile to markets and enterprise. So to stop it was seen as very desirable. But And it was correctly understood that if you were to defeat healthcare, that would be the end of the Obama presidency. It would be a humiliation and a defeat from which he could not recover, and his party would be shattered. The problem is the Democrats had seen this movie too, and they knew exactly what the Republicans knew. And since it was suicide for them, and since everybody knew it was going to be suicide for them, and since they also knew it was going to be suicide for them, it was predictable that they would not do it. And since they had the votes to avoid doing it, if they cajoled and worked together, it was predictable that they would get a health care bill through of some kind through the House and Senate. At that point, the question became, how do we make sure that this health care bill does as little harm as possible? Health care reform is inherently redistributive. Its spending is inherently, it redistributes from, in American health care reform, because so many people have such generous health insurance while others have nothing at all, it inherently distributes from the more affluent part of the party, the country, to the younger, to the less affluent, and from older people who are covered by the generous program of Medicare to younger people who are not, who have private insurance or nothing at all. Given that that was so, it is especially dangerous for the funding mechanism of the healthcare reform also to be heavily redistributive. But that is what the Democrats wrote. They wrote a funding mechanism that taxed income, taxed investment income as well, in order to finance the first down payments on what's going to be a very, very costly stream of subsidies. And the bill, although paid lip service to the idea of cost controls in healthcare, American healthcare costs are simply extraordinary, as you all know. The United States spends 70% of GDP on health. The next runner-up is Switzerland, which spends 13%. If the United States spent what Switzerland spends as a share of national income, it would be the equivalent of getting the U.S. defense budget for free. That is not a small piece of money. That was the opportunity. That was the play to make, and it was not made. Instead, pursuing a total defeat of President Obama, what was instead inflicted was a total defeat on the Republicans. Now, Republicans, as with the Toomey as with the transfer, the likely transfer of the Pennsylvania seat from Specter to Toomey, so Republicans have said this is indeed a glorious victory because people don't like the health care reform, and therefore they will vote against the Democrats. But congressional majorities come and go. This health care bill is forever. It cannot be repealed. It is mathematically impossible for it to be repealed. Mike Huckabee went on Saturday Night Live during his presidential campaign. Somebody said to him, it's mathematically impossible that you can win the nomination. And he said, look, everybody uses the phrase mathematically impossible. Nobody can ever tell me what it means. So let me tell you what it means. It means that if Republicans had won every single seat that was on, Senate seat that was on the ballot in 2010, every one, including the ones heavily favored from the Democrats, including ones held by Democratic incumbents, every single one of the 33 seats that are on the ballot this year, they still would not have enough Senate seats to override the presidential veto. So when you write the law repealing health care, you pass it through the House, assuming a Republican majority, you pass it through the Senate, assuming that the Republicans have won every single seat. When the president vetoes it, now you need 2/3 of both houses to override that veto. That cannot be done, even if the Republicans win everything, which they want. That bill is here for a long time to come. And we have traded a temporary success, a political success, for a huge policy and a permanent policy defeat. One of the things that I have often wondered during the course of the past 2 years is whether Republicans really oppose the Obama health care bill as much as they say they did, and as much as I would have thought they should. Because at every given moment, they put short-term political advantage as their top priority, and the defeat or the change of the health care bill as a very secondary priority. Now we are going to have this Republican majority in the House, and we're going to have an improvement of the Republican position in the Senate. But the Republicans are going to arrive with fury, with commitment, with determination, with a lot of dislike of the president, but with no policy agenda at all. And they are going to arrive in the middle of what will very soon be an intense policy crisis. As you all know, the Bush tax cuts expired in January of 2010. They came with the expiry date, by the way, as a way of complying with / evading the budget rules of Congress that required deficit neutrality over 10 years to get expedited treatment through the Senate. They expired. Everybody assumes that some deal will be put together to renew them in some way. Many Democrats want some version of it. They want to renew some of the Bush tax cuts, but not all of them. Republicans want to renew all of them. You would think that this would not be such an impossible divide to cross, but for reasons I will lay out in the London Times tomorrow morning, it will be impossible. But nobody understands this yet. The expectation is that the deal will be done. It will not be done. And the United States economy will be in for a deflationary shock in January. And the anger, as Republicans discover, they're not going to be able to muscle President Obama to get what they want on the tax bill. That President Obama, in fact, on this issue is going to be able to mobilize quite a lot of public opinion, is going to then trigger other Republican reactions. We're going to see attempts to defund the health care bill. That is, not being able to repeal it, just don't appropriate the money to put it into effect. And we're going to see a campaign of investigations of administration officials, subpoenas, attempts to discover various kinds of wrongdoing that would be ways to paralyze the work of the administration. We are heading for a paralysis of government. But unlike our last paralysis of government in 1998, 1999, this will not occur at a time of prosperity. This will occur at a time of extreme economic distress, at a time when Americans are looking to the country, to the government for answers. And when they are not, despite what the Tea Party people tell you, they are not seized of libertarian furor. The Tea Party people might be libertarians. That is not why the Republicans are going to win. Reason number one for the big Republican victory is obsession, and reason number two is President Obama's attempt to cut Medicare. Those are the two issues that are mobilizing voters. They are not inherently libertarian reasons. And the second is an anti-libertarian reason. So don't mistake where the voters are. Republicans do not have a plan. They insist their goal is to cut the deficit. Not only do they not have a plan to do so, they affirmatively oppose such a plan. The Republican pledge, the voters, which is the closest thing we have to a policy document, exempts from cuts anything to do with pensioners, anything to do with national defense. And that, though, when you start thinking through what that means, they are putting 80% of the budget off limits. They're trying to extract a deficit, closing a deficit that is about 8 points of GDP, based on only 20% of the federal budget. Obviously, that arithmetic does not work. One of the things that is also striking about this is that Republicans have budget ideas in the middle of the worst downturn since the war. They do not have economic ideas. When you ask Republicans, well, do you have any ideas at all, they will cite the famous budget plan of Representative Paul Ryan. And there's a lot of good to say about this plan, but it is a budget plan. It is not a growth plan. It is not an economic plan. And by the way, while everybody cites it with approval, nobody will endorse it, because the major working piece of this plan is to cut off the Medicare benefit as it is now constituted for people currently under age 55. So what I see here is a party that is brought to power by circumstances very different from those which is bringing it to power in the House of Representatives and maybe the Senate, that does not have a policy agenda, that has tapped into a great vein of economic frustration, that has expressed a lot of, that is expressing a point of view that is culturally militant, that has a culturally adversarial approach, that is a party that is not succeeding in broadening its appeal. The Republican Party remains the party of white people who have not finished college, especially older, especially male. That remains the identity of the party. It's that, fortunately for them in the off years, the electorate shrinks. Only about 40% of Americans or less will probably turn out in 2010. The systematic problems with the Republican future that were there through the Bush years are there now, despite this big victory. And we're going to have to think very hard, starting after January. We're going to have the deception of a success that occurred for reasons that we fail to understand, and that has put us in a position of crisis and confrontation for which we are not ready. So I worry enormously about what is to come. I think we have much to learn from your example in Britain. I am a great believer, and I will end here and take questions. I'm a great believer in the saying that it's good to learn from experience, but better to learn from other people's experience. I hope we are able to put the Republicans on a better path thanks to the positive example of British conservatives, rather than through the negative example of unsuccess in the American House of Representatives and Senate. And I thank you, and I hope I haven't taxed your patience too much.
Very good. Okay, well, we've got a whole range of things that we could ask about, from the midterms through to 2012, and perhaps even what David thinks of David Cameron. So I'll take questions in groups of two, so we can sort of let's start here and say who you are and where you're coming from.
Thank you very much. My name is David Brains. Thank you very much for your presentation. I have two short questions. Firstly, you suggested that the Republicans are going to win back the House, which is highly likely in November. Do you have any suggestions of the candidates for Speaker following November that we should look out for? Also, 2012 is quickly coming up, and the Republicans are in as much disarray now as they were pre-2008. Is it likely we're going to find a candidate that's going to beat Obama? Who should we look out for? And is there any chance of the party coming together to try and win?
Sounds like two questions to go with. So.
The Boehner speaker, I don't think there's any doubt, or any serious doubt, that John Boehner will be chosen as Speaker. But the question mark over him, there is a question mark over him, and it's this. He is, as speakers go, he will not be a very powerful speaker. And he has already signaled how, and the way to think about this, it isn't that you have this giant, unruly mass of people that are together too strong for the single speaker. It's that this is more that there are three groups in contention. There's the speaker himself, there are the committee chairs, so the leaders of the party, and then there are the rank and file. Think of it like a feudal system. There's the king, there are the barons, and there are the peasants. Now, the king and the barons together have enough power to overawe the peasants, but this king on his own does not have enough power to overawe the peasants. So he must work with the barons, and he's already signaled. He gave an interview to, I forget now, either The Hill or Roll Call, one of our two parliamentary, congressional newspapers, that said that he was looking forward to see more power go to the committee chairman. So they are going to be much stronger than they were in the last Republican government because the speaker is less strong. That tells you something about the shape of Republican governments. Because when the committee chairs are in the ascendancy, so is Kingsford. Now, as to the presidency, the way I would think about this, I'm not going to make a prediction today, but I would think about the race in this way. There are 4 tiers of candidates going into 2012. The first tier are people who have high degrees of support in the polls and also a lot of money on hand. And that's a universe of 3, Mitt Romney, Sarah Palin, and Newt Gingrich. The second tier are people who have high degree of support in the polls with no money on hand. That's a tier of 1, Mike Huckabee. The third tier are people who have neither support in the polls nor money, but who hold an office that is where it's plausible that they could be president. Those are people like Governor Daniels of Indiana, those are like Senator Thune, those are people like there are a number of senators and governors who fall into that third tier. And the fourth tier are people who do not have that, who have neither support nor money, nor traditional office, but who have some kind of emotional connection to an important part of the party, and who therefore can maybe run ideas candidates. And John Bolton, for example, has discussed being such a kind of candidate. The people who are in tier 1 each have extraordinary vulnerabilities. The Republican presidential process normally works in a fairly orderly way. The person who got the second most votes last time gets the prize next time. That is a pattern that goes back in every election since 1976, with the exception of 2000, when the Republicans chose the son of the guy who had been there last time. This time, it looks like that won't happen. I mean, Mitt Romney has great structural weaknesses. Gingrich and Palin also. It's not clear at all that Mike Huckabee is actually seriously pursuing it. He's not doing the things you do if you seriously pursue it. So we're already probably down into the third tier, most likely. And that makes us very much look like a Democratic race, a very wide open race.
Post-privilege.
David, I'm Neil Bryan, I'm Director of Policy Exchange. It's great to have you here. And I was reminded of your point about the kind of the temporary victory of the Conservatives' great win in the 1999 Euro elections, which was swiftly followed by the second biggest kicking in 100 years in the next election. But I wanted to ask you about the politics of deficit reduction in America. Before the general election here, the opposition parties did a reasonably good job, though not as much as I'd like, of convincing the public that we did have a major problem with debt and deficit. Where has that debate got to in the US? Does it play? Are people worried yet?
People are enormously worried about deficits. Voters are. And for good reason. And not only, they also assimilate the problem of public debt with the problem of their own private debt. That the fundamental background cause of this economic crisis was the extraordinary accumulation of debt in the household sector that predictably collapsed, although if we could have predicted the exact date at which it would collapse, we would all be meeting in much nicer premises. And so these things do resonate. The way in which American governments spend money, however, makes it difficult for a party to do this kind of deficit cutting on the kind of budgetary basis that we do in the United Kingdom. The American health system, of all the money that is spent in the U.S. health system, about half is spent by government of one kind or another. By the time you go to Medicare, which is for the elderly, Medicaid for the poor, veterans benefits, sole benefits for active duty military, the Indian Health Service, you're up to about 50 cents out of every dollar. We also spend about $200 billion a year in tax expenditure, which is the value of the exclusion of existing health benefits from income tax. So that if you receive your compensation in the form of that kind of benefit, it's not taxable to you, and that is again a valuable thing. But none of those things are appropriated through our budgetary process. Congress writes a law defining who is eligible. If you qualify and get the benefit, the only way to save money in these kinds of programs is by actually revising the program and having a plan to revise the program. And Republicans, by and large, do not have those plans. Various ideas have been floated in the past, but none of them have any kind of backing. And in the summer of the town halls, in the summer of 2009, Republican after Republican insisted that a Republican government means no cuts in Medicare, just as the Conservatives are now the party of the NHS, the Republicans are now the party of Medicare. But Medicare is a program that's growing in cost much faster than the NHS, and it's hard if you're the party of Medicare to see how, without a great deal of rethinking, you can bring much budget discipline. The Republicans are going to end up scrounging through the various programs that are appropriated in search of minor savings. This is another reason that I'm so worried about this Tea Party movement, is that party's ideology cannot be divorced from a party's social base. In the days when the Republican Party was the party of people with college degrees, it was the party of entrepreneurs and business people, it was very naturally a party of enterprise. But when you discover that the Republicans, who once had a huge advantage among people with college degrees, are now roughly breaking even. And when you discover that upper income people voted actually for Obama over McCain in 2008, they'll probably be back in 2010. Who knows what 2012? When you're sustaining the party of the center right with the votes of people who are the most dependent, the group of the population most dependent on government, you face a real political paradox.
Very good. I'll take one more at the back and then take some from this side. Again, say who you are.
Thank you. Sam Coates, I head up the online operations for the Conservative Party. Aside from the politics of the Tea Party, to what extent do you think it'll have an impact on a sort of more organisational level? So, I mean, to some extent, the Obama campaign started this sort of more bottom-up revolution. It was kind of half spider, half starfish, to use the analogy, in terms of centralised branding, centralised, organisation, but on the lower level it was kind of more self-organising. Whereas the Tea Party is clearly very leaderless. I mean, to what extent do you think the sort of death of the spider has been exaggerated, or do you think this is something of an inevitability that with the internet, going to see much more sort of bottom-up organisation in American politics?
That's a very profound question. I'm not sure I'm prepared to give it the answer it deserves. So rather than try to answer it coherently, let me just produce a couple of observations. One is, I think with the Obama campaign in particular, the extent to which it was a bottom-up phenomenon can be, and almost always is, tremendously exaggerated. The Obama campaign had so much money that they didn't have to make choices. They could do a little of everything. And they also had so much wind on their back that they could afford a lot of mistakes. There's a common theory, for example, one of the things that killed John Dean, Sergeant Howard Dean in 2004, was all the support he had from all of these spontaneous organizations. They would meet, they would would meet up on Facebook. They would, I guess Facebook didn't exist in 2004. They would meet electronically. They would gather together. They would arrive in Iowa. They would sleep in tent on the floor of the hotel room. They would knock on people's doors, and the voters wouldn't like them. They would, in fact, really dislike them. They were from out of state. They were young. They were too know-it-all. And there was a lot of reporting that suggests that being visited by a Howard Dean solicitor was a very negative experience for Iowa voters. So that can be, but the Obama people didn't have to worry about that because they had a big lead. I think it can also be exaggerated. I don't think the Tea Party is, as the Democrats sometimes suggest, a manufactured phenomenon, but it's also clear that they have the benefit of much more professional management today than they did a year ago. One of the things, if you've ever organized a demonstration, you know, it's Rule 101, that if you're going to demonstrate at point A, you have people attending the demonstration meet at point B. And at point B, you look at their signs and make sure no one's saying anything offensive, check them for drugs and alcohol, you take a look and see if there's someone that was there to sabotage the protest. When the Tea Party protest began, nobody did those things. But today, this past summer when they met, somebody was doing those things. And the benefits of the help of people like Americans for Prosperity, which is a very professional group, I think that really had an impact on the success of the Tea Party. But I think that maybe the core answer to this, politics is a 24/7 business, and spontaneous organization happens in moments of crisis. And it is a great mistake for people in politics to think that spontaneous organization is a tool of politics. It will happen, and it will happen more easily than it happened in former times. And it will have to happen more easily than it did in former times because of the death of all kinds of mediating institutions. In Britain, as in the United States, things like churches, things like unions, things like veterans organizations, they all have much less salience, much less purchase than they used to do. But when it's normal times, when you're trying to pass a normal bill through the Parliament to a Congress, you cannot assume that those groups will be there. They are temporary and occasional phenomenon that arises in moments of stress.
So, lady there in blue, didn't say you are.
Antonia Cox, I was a policy advisor to Shelley Cabinet before the election of 40 seats for the Conservatives. In this room, a couple of years ago, John Mickleway put forward the idea of the book, The Right Nation, which suggested a much more optimistic picture of the Republican Party than you painted. In particular, the rise of Hispanics and other minorities who have entrepreneurial values, family values, that kind of thing. What's gone wrong with that picture?
Well, it was wrong from the start. The portrait of the Hispanic, there's an old saying in certain kinds of business enterprises, you can lie to the tax man, you can lie to the banker, but never lie to yourself. And I think a lot of what Republicans said about the Hispanic vote took the form of self-deception. The fact is, Hispanics are not a socially conservative group. They may give socially conservative answers when you ask a poll question, especially their attitudes toward homosexuality. But it's very hard to organize a group of economically necessitous people on the grounds of their dislike of another group of people whom first they never really encounter, and second, where it's not outside the rules of your political system. If you did have some kind of populist anti-homosexual party out there, maybe, but if it's just something the Republicans are going to dog whistle every 4 years, it's not going to work. What we discover about social conservatism, if social conservatism reflects how you live your life, do you go to church a lot? Do you get married before you have children? Then Hispanics are not a socially conservative group. The rate of out-of-wedlock birth among Hispanics is rapidly rising. And although I think at this point about half of all Hispanic children are born outside of marriage. And because Hispanic women tend to have more children than black women, that although the black rate is higher, when you look at what is the race of America's population of children of unmarried parents, the Hispanics occupy a larger and larger fraction, and I think on their way to a majority of that population. Second, Hispanics is a very bad category, I think, in terms of, it would be as if somebody in British politics said, well, I'm very interested in the Asian vote. And they use that to cover every single ethnicity from Lebanon to Indonesia. That the Hispanic vote includes Cuban Americans, who are very heavily Republican, becoming less so, but still heavily Republican. It includes immigrants from places like Ecuador and Argentina, who we have a good number, who are reasonably reachable by the Republicans. They tend to arrive with higher levels of education. But the single largest group are Mexican Americans and Central Americans. And they are not reachable by Republicans because they are very poor. And the thing that makes, this suggestion that they're entrepreneurial, God bless them. They have an incredible work ethic, if you're going to generalize about a group of people. But what you notice is as they become more affluent, they become less entrepreneurial because the self-owned enterprises they run tend to be very marginal. And as they rise, they migrate into jobs that is not their preference of employment. They don't migrate into professions, they migrate into other kinds of blue-collar wage work. But this group is not well educated, it is not affluent, and it receives relatively little aid from the state right now because it is very largely non-citizen and therefore not eligible. But again, as it assimilates, it will become eligible for benefits from the state, and it will like those. The group will like those benefits. So the idea, this was a big idea that was argued by Karl Rove and George Bush, and I think they persuaded Micklethwaite and Woolridge of it, but it was just always a fantasy, and it is a problem. But it is not as big a problem in the short term as a problem of the decline of Republican voting among college-educated people and the decline of Republican voting among married women. These are two groups that were once bastions of the Republican Party that have increasingly moved out of the Republican column.
Very good. Sir,
Jonathan Aiken, two quick questions about the current occupant of the White House and his predecessor. President Obama is apparently making a huge campaigning effort as we get to the November midterms to rally the liberal base. So far, from 3,000 miles away, it seems rather unsuccessful and rather petulant. The Wisconsin speech, the Berlin Stone, and so on. Is he going to pull it back or not? Question one. Question two, you worked for President Bush. When he left, he said that he owed it to his successor to keep us silent, which he's done, but he's about to break it with his memoirs. What sort of legacy has he got today or in the future?
Two very good questions. Let me answer the first about President Obama. Actually, there's just a study released today. Let me see if I can remember the details of it correctly. But I think, I won't remember the details of it, but the bottom line of it was his message is being tested to see how it resonates, and it's terrible. As you say, he is sounding petulant. And his message boils down to things might have been worse. This is no fun for me either. I think there's actually Joe Biden's message. Joe Biden said, "This is not my joke. I'm going to steal this from a friend of mine." Joe Biden's message has been, "You're disappointed in me. We're disappointed in you." I think there will be some rallying, as there always is in the last weeks of an election campaign. That we have a huge number of disheartened, disaffected Democrats, and they'll come home and probably come to vote. But less than you would normally expect because of a technicality in the way American elections work. Unlike here, not only is it difficult to register in the United States, but it's even more difficult to stay registered. So remember, you're registered by the states, not by the federal government. So if you live in Georgia, you're a young man, you've been working at a job in Georgia, and you are registered to vote there, and you lose your job, and you decide, well, see how things are in South Carolina, and you go there and you stay with your sister maybe for a little while you look for work, and it's not going so well, so you make a side trip to North Carolina, that's no better, you come back to South Carolina. You have 6 months before you are required to change your driver's license to the state of your new residence. Typically, the way people register is at the time they get their driver's license. So if this young man from Georgia is moving, trying South Carolina, trying North Carolina, and he happens to be in North Carolina for the 3 weeks before voting day, he's not going to be on a roll in North Carolina. And he won't be back in Georgia to be physically present to vote there. And unless he gets himself organized to cast an absentee ballot, which young people often don't do, he's not going to be registered in the place where he lives. And I think that is going to be something that was phenomenal in this election. As to President Bush, I think my verdict is that that his legacy will be seen as twofold. I think he will get more and more credit for his international legacy. That in the years from 1993 to 2001, the Western world was hit by a series of terrorist attacks of increasing sophistication, complexity, more and more working parties, more and more people across more and more continents. And while terrorism continues to strike, each operation seems to be less complex, less sophisticated than the one before. The underwear bomber, his operation failed because he had to make his own, but the bomb carrier and the bomb maker were the same person. It turned out he wasn't good at making bombs, and so the bomb didn't go off. And that has been true that with the attempted bombing in Germany in 2006, the bombs were not made properly. So these groups are obviously not able to communicate safely. They're being chopped into pieces, and that is an important step on putting them on the way to defeat. I think that both the President's major strategic decisions, one is to make Iraq a priority, the second is not to go too long on Afghan futures. But both of those are going to look increasingly wise, because we are discovering from current hard experience why it was that President Bush did not want to put 100,000 troops into Afghanistan. We've done it, and we'll see how it goes. We all hope it goes well, but it's nervous-making. Domestically, however, that his economic legacy is hard. It's going to be hard to come up with much of a defense here. It didn't go well. It didn't go well during the good days when the average person saw his or her income shrink after inflation, and it ended in this terrible catastrophe. But one more thing that he deserves credit for, which is President Bush. The problem that I've outlined was one that President Bush recognized. He understood that the formulas that had worked for Republicans in the 1970s and 1980s were not going to continue to work 20 and 30 years later. And he understood that conservatism, that you don't adapt to a new time simply by saying the same thing, only louder. And he was not able to come up with a policy answer, but I think he indicated some of the lines of a political answer. I think that was fruitful.
Okay, as time moves on, I think I'll start taking questions in bunches of two, and we'll just sort of have our answers relatively. Let's go back to this side.
Yeah, can we ask about the reset policy of President Obama is an issue that has an impact on...
Speak up for people
sorry.
at the back. Say who you are.
Yeah, Jonathan Horseman, sorry. I was asking about the reset policy, and that's one area of foreign policy with which President Obama has had some success. But it has an impact. There is an assumption that it's having a quid pro quo impact on relations in the European space, and particularly sort of Central and Eastern Europe. What prospects for reset following November, and if you can sort of cast forward to 2012 as well?
And again, say who you are.
Jonathan McClory from the Institute for Government. Question about modernisation of parties. Does the sort of decentralised nature of American politics make modernising incredibly difficult? If you contrast it to, say, the British experience, where Cameron and a relatively small group of people were able to really modernise the Tory party.
See if you can weave those two.
The reset phrase was really applied to Russian policy, and that is not something I know a lot about, so I'm going to have to be very circumspect. President Obama's record in foreign affairs is not looking very promising right now, and in particular, the promise he made, or the idea he had, was that by adopting a softer tone, not only would he please the Europeans, but he would actually get practical results out of the Europeans that were of benefit to the United States and its interests. And particularly, that he would be able, through a softer tone, to rally them to support a sanctions policy on Iran. And that, I think, has proven to be completely false. The Iran policy is as flummoxed as it ever was. The Europeans, I think, appreciate his tone, but they don't pay for that tone with any advances of their own. And the relations are, in some cases, actually more strained. I think, especially the relationship with France, more strained than it was in the second Bush term. And all of this is dwarfed by the challenge of Afghanistan and the difficult future we see there. But there I'm going outside of my area of expertise. On modernization, that's a really good point. I mean, you could have a dinner party in Islington or wherever they did, Notting Hill, I guess, and decide things are going to be completely different, and things, in fact, would be completely different. And you can't do that in the United States. That said, success tends to be copied in the United States. And the way modernization will probably occur is through it being perceived that certain kinds of methods don't work, certain kinds of candidates fail, and that if other methods do seem to work, and if other kinds, I think it had a big impact on the shape of the Republican Party in the 90s. That not only were Rudy Giuliani and Richard Riordan elected in, and let's not forget actually Tommy Thompson in Wisconsin was very important, and John Engler in Michigan. So you had these Republicans being elected in cities and in industrial states, delivering really effective government, being very successful, particularly with the crime and welfare problems that were so important in the 1990s. And that had a great influence on the National Republican Party. And in the same way, I think that the Republican perception of George Bush as a moderate, quote unquote, and the perception that his presidency failed, at least in domestic policy, is the background cause of the Tea Party. I think one of the things that gives the Tea Party a lot of its emotional energy is that it is a place to put all the accumulated but inexpressible anger left over at the disappointments of the Bush years. And Freudian psychologists have a lot of interest in this. There are things sometimes that our family dynamics do not allow us to say, but that we feel nonetheless, and then an opportunity comes to say them in a different context, and that's where we express them.
We'll take two more from over here.
Matthew Sinclair from the Taxpayers Alliance. Nate Silver, I think, characterised the influence of the Tea Party roughly as it gives the Republicans some candidates who are harder to elect, but a lot more energy and activity broadly, and some good popularity that they lacked before. It seems to me you're counting one side of the ledger. So on healthcare, for example, you count troublesome candidate on inspectors switching sides. You don't count the energy which may have seriously emboldened dissenters within the Democrats and unified the Republicans. And they did get the public option stopped, which seems important. They did succeed entirely in stopping cap and trade, which is, I'd say, a big policy debate. And it strikes me that follows through to other sides. I mean, in the UK, you've got, we've sort of crawled our way into a coalition government with states spending over 50% of GDP. It seems that you could say that there have been some pretty huge successes from Republicans, even in the direct sort of policy terms you're talking about.
Okay, and just add one more question.
Tom Greaves, I've knocked around the Conservative circles for a long time and actually volunteered for the GOP a few years ago. It's sort of related to the penultimate questioner's question. I read and very much enjoyed your book, Dead Right. One of the things that came through is a massive variety of opinion among leading Republicans then, and I think still now, particularly about economic matters. And it seems that the religious right and then latterly the Tea Party have sort of swept in and both said either this is what the Republican Party stands for or it should be. And I'm wondering how someone can kind of come through the middle of that and articulate a more appealing ideology for the Republican Party. And also I'm going to be cheeky and ask you if you've identified someone specific who might be able to do that.
Oh, okay. Let me do those two questions in reverse order. First, one should not underestimate the religious element in the Tea Party. One of the things that is often said is the Tea Party is an economic and libertarian movement that is non-religious. I don't think that's exactly right. And let me point to two examples. You all know the story of what happened in Delaware, that Mike Castle, a person favored by the party establishment, was rejected in favor of a very marginal candidate, Christine O'Donnell. The thing that really is very striking, Castle is one of the few outspokenly pro-choice Republicans seeking statewide office. And I think that as much as his TARP vote and his interest in environmental issues helped to kill him. Now look what happened in New Hampshire, where the party establishment was behind a woman named Kelly Ayotte, and Senator DeMint backed a more radical candidate, Ovi LaMontagne. It was much more the Tea Party style. Kelly Ayotte was the state attorney general, very classic kind of Northeastern Republican. But Kelly Ayotte was pro-life. And in fact, had taken a pro-life stand as state attorney general and defended some of the state's laws against a challenge from pro-choice groups. She was acceptable to the pro-lifers. Castle was not. Therefore, the Tea Party challenge to her was much less effective and failed. I think when you go through it, you see how much of that element is present. And when you survey Tea Party people, increasingly discover that they are not irreligious people. The image of sharply divided, radical economic conservative, the idea that there's a big libertarian, a true libertarian in the sense of Ayn Rand, secular, socially permissive, but economically in favor of minimal government, that's easily overstated. Have I picked out somebody? No, I haven't. And as to the question of reading the ledger, it's a very important and powerful question. But I think the premises buried in the question are not right. The public option, it would be like saying that the Tea Party helped to kill card check, which is the change that the Democrats wanted to make in the trade union laws. The fact is, the Senate Democrats never wanted those things. The big problem for cap and trade is not Republicans and the Tea Party. It never came to a vote in the Senate because of the coal Democrats. The Democrats from coal-producing states don't want it. And they had the power to stop it. So I don't want to say that the Tea Party has obviously succeeded in raising a lot of money. And it has brought to the fore some good candidates. Marco Rubio in Florida is a better candidate and will be a better senator than Charlie Crist would have been. So that's real talent that got a chance because of the Tea Party. And I think there are some other people in some other states. And Joe Miller in Alaska. I mean, the nepotist Lisa Murkowski versus Joe Miller, who, by the way, is graduate of the Yale Law School and former Army prosecutor. That is the kind of person the Republicans typically send to the United States Senate. He's more of a normal Republican United States Senator than Lisa Murkowski was. So those are gains. But in policy terms, I think that the defeat on health care was overwhelming. The defeat of the public option was a Democratic victory, not an internal one, not a Republican one. So I think when I look at the ledger, I see, yes, a lot of money was raised, a lot of careers have been made, there have been changes in the internal, a lot of people have had internal, have had their careers advanced within the Republican Party. But as I said, the conclusion I get from is the Republicans cannot have been as opposed to healthcare reform as they said, or they would have fought it much more with much more tactical savvy than they did.
Very good. Okay, gentleman in the pink shirt.
Thank you, David. So I got a very sore throat from going to Tory conference and staying up too late, so forgive my voice. We've got two very impressive businesswomen standing in California, they're typically Democrat states. Do you think they've both got a chance of winning? And do you see people who've had good careers outside politics and then turning to politics becoming more common in the states going forward?
We just passed them to the gent in front of you in a grey suit.
I was wondering, Tom Packer, Oxford University. I do a doctorate in recent American Conservatism. I was wondering, why do you think the Conservatives, if I accept Tea Party is a bit too unreconstructed fact right to be like the perfect political model, but why do you think the Conservatives didn't win the election when it's looking very likely the Republicans will win the House of Representatives, and why Tony Abbott, running against the only government with a very good economic record in the Western world, nearly won? And in particular, what role do you give to the Republican defeats? The one the TARP bailout and the identification of the Republican Party through George Bush, even though most Republicans in the House voted against it, with a massive bailout to bankers, and the degree to which the Tea Party has rebranded the Republican Party as being a party that opposes bailouts to large corporations rather than for them. And secondly, the enormous unpopularity of the Iraq War. Of course, I remember having agreed with you at the time that you have been one of the leading advocates of, which I think it's very hard to argue in 2006 didn't play a huge role. And again, the Republican Party is rebranding that. Republican candidate in Kentucky, Brown Bull, is very anti-Iraq War. So what role, why do you think Cameronism did not deliver a majority, if that is such a working model? And secondly, what role do you see in the problems of the Republican Party caused by TARP and the Iraq War?
Okay. Let me deal with the first question first, so I can deal with it quite concisely. In California, there are two businesswomen running. Meg Whitman, the creator, the first CEO of eBay, who looks quite likely to win the governor's race. She's had a bad week. Turns out she employed an illegal alien and didn't treat her properly, and there's some litigation about that. But probably that's not going to be enough to stop her. She's up against Jerry Brown, the former governor of California, and a person who just seems like out of his time. The senatorial race puts Carly Fiorina against Barbara Boxer. That's a closer call, I think, although I think there's enough of a wind in the sails to elect Carly Fiorina, so I hope there is. She was not, in the primary I preferred another candidate, a man named Tom Campbell, who's who's a friend of mine, basically. But that's okay, right? I mean, what is politics about? But I think Carly will, and she is sort of a model. She is somebody who's got, she was the CEO of Hewlett Packard, and she's got, again, a business story to tell. And that is, I think, a good way. And it was also very welcome to have prominent women in positions of leadership in the Republican Party. As to the second question, there's a lot there. I'm not sure I can unpack it all. But let me try a couple of things. First, I agree with you that Iraq was a big factor in 2006. I don't think it was such a big factor in 2008. And it's true. I mean, one of the things I think that you sense in the Tea Party is this is obviously not a group of people who are very concerned about international affairs. And as they come to Washington and they deal with the budget problem, and how much of the budget is spent on defense, and how averse they are going to be to doing anything but spending on the elderly, Medicare and Social Security, it is bound to occur to them that one way that they can do more to keep their promises on deficits is by going after the defense budget, especially a defense budget of a Democratic president who they are going to persuade themselves is a threat to the Republic, and in a war that is going to be even more frustrating, if maybe not as expensive as Iraq was. Why did David Cameron not get a majority? I am not going to presume to answer that in this room. You all know much more about that than I do. But I think in every case, when you're assessing the success of political operation, you have to look how high was the hill that person had to climb, and that you look at somebody that Al Gore is dining out forever on the fact that he got more votes than George Bush did in 2000. Well, congratulations. Why didn't you get a lot more votes than George Bush did? You had peace, you had prosperity, you had a popular president who would have won a third term had he been on the ballot, and you managed to mess that up. How did you do that? You never, I mean, there are no marks for beating the spread in actual politics, but as you observe it, you have to think about that. In that case, have you ever read it?
I said Labour was screwed. They had hugely unpopular prime minister.
They did, but they also had a map that favored them, and they had socio-demographics that favored them. And you might say that looking at the recent past, that the Conservatives had a very, very big hill to climb in terms of making themselves voters acceptable. And I worry that that is the future. That is the direction Republicans are on. That Republicans get, as they go from getting 60 to 65 to 68% of the non-college white vote, there comes a point where you just bump up against the limits. I mean, some of those people belong to trade unions. Some of those people are gay. I mean, they're just, you're just not going to get those people for today's Republican Party. And then, meanwhile, if you have alienated every non-white entrepreneur in the country, if you have offended every single woman in the country and every non-American, how do you put together your mountain has been made bigger and bigger and bigger? Oh, TARP. Look, I think TARP saved the world, and it was not popular. It was ugly, but what is the saying? There's no idea in politics as powerful as a bad idea whose time has come. That TARP saved the world, and we never know. One of the sort of systematic injustices of politics is nobody ever gets credit for the bad things that don't happen. And supposing there had been some guy on the sidewalk standing there beside Gavrilo Princip in Sarajevo in 1914, and he'd seen the gun and knocked him dead, and the gun had gone off and Princip had been arrested, would anybody ever have known that guy's name, even like 6 months later? But he would have saved the world. And in the same way, what was behind door number 2 with TARP, and for sure Republicans are blamed for it. But I think one of the things that has really happened to, one of the negative consequences is that we have a party that has made, that yes, people have lost office for supporting TARP, that we have given a tremendous incentive to politicians. The next time they're faced with a crisis, the politicians did not make, or at least the senators didn't make, you can argue bad regulators made, that the disincentives to doing something that is brave and necessary it is a little story about how you're going to be left out underrepresented if you do the right thing and say the word.
Very good. Look, I think on the spirit of, I know there's a few more people with questions, but on the spirit of leaving you wanting more, then we'll wrap it up. But 7:45, it's getting warm in here, so let me ask you to give David a warm round of applause and thank you.